Thank you, Richard, Rebecca, and the Asia CEO team. Thank you for all of you, for being here this morning. It's a privilege to be here at this event. Yusek Dave, Architect June. When the promo graphic for this event came out, a friend of mine sent it to me, and I said if Architect June and I had sent in shirtless photos, it would look like we were fighting for the WBA maybe middleweight belt. Can you put it up again? No, I think you know what I mean. Anyway, so Architect June, I am outclassed at this event as well as if it were boxing. Anyway, it's a privilege to share with you what we do in the strategy, economics, and results group of the Department of Finance, but more importantly, why we do it. But before I go to the comprehensive tax reform program, let me start with some of the macro numbers on how we're doing. Let me begin by sharing that we had healthy revenue collections in 2018. These collections are necessary to help us make significant economic investments to sustain our growth momentum long into the future. If you look at the right column, our revenue effort increased to 16.9% in the first 3 quarters of the year, the highest ever achieved for the first 3 quarters of any year. Likewise, our tax effort inched up to 15.2%, similarly the highest tax effort ever achieved in any 3 quarters of the first 3 quarters of a year. That means we are joining the ranks of the best managed economies in the region. We also had a very effective asset management performance in 2018. Dividends remitted by government-owned and controlled corporations, such as the one Yusek Dave leads. And by the way, Yusek Dave, my father was with PITC when I was around 3 years old. We were based in West Germany, at the time when there was still West and East Germany. And he would bring us to East Germany through Checkpoint Charlie, to see if we could find markets for Philippine products. This was in the late 70s. Anyway, in terms of asset management, dividends remitted by government-owned and controlled corporations breached the 40 billion peso mark as of the 2nd week of December last year, the highest amount ever collected since the law requiring state firms to hand over 50% of their annual net earnings was enacted into law in 1994. Total dividend remittances reached 47.99 billion pesos as of November 2018, clearly demonstrating a high level of fiscal discipline. I'm also glad to report that we had successfully negotiated for ODA financing for the Build program, and the Department of Finance adapted the fast and sure approach in successfully negotiating concessional financing for the infrastructure program. The Metro Manila subway project, for instance, is one of the softest loans we have ever negotiated. The 104.53 billion yen or $935 million agreement for the first tranche carries an interest rate of 10 basis points per annum for non-consulting services and 1 basis point per annum for consulting services, payable in 40 years, inclusive of a 12-year grace period. That's one example of the ODA financing that we have in place now. We are also happy to share that investors have demonstrated their high level of confidence in the Philippine economy under the Duterte administration, with the tight spreads of the country's dollar, yen, and renminbi denominated bonds issued separately in 2018. The spreads ranged from 34.7 to 37.8 basis points above benchmark. In addition to all of this, we have the comprehensive tax reform program, which I will get to shortly. But first, I'd like to tell you a story that is very close to my heart. It is a story about one of the major efforts that we run at the department called Sulong Pilipinas. Roughly translates to Forward Philippines. It is the Philippine Development Forum, an annual consultative workshop during which the administration's economic team consults the business sector on its concerns and desired key reforms. Here's how it started. A few weeks before the administration took office in 2016, a group of volunteers gathered in Davao to brainstorm on what to do next. My former boss in the Office of the President under the Arroyo administration, former Secretary Paul Dominguez, brother of my current boss, said we should hold a consultation with the business sector on what was then the newly articulated 0 to 10-point socioeconomic agenda. When we pitched our ideas to the incoming cabinet members, I suggested that instead of the usual expert-led conference, we do an interactive 21st century town hall. Then incoming Finance Secretary Sunny Dominguez turned to me and said, okay, tell us more about this and where have you actually done this? I asked him to imagine a large hall with hundreds of people seated at round tables, like these tables that we have today, each sharing their ideas and making their own actionable recommendations to government. Each participant would also be asked to comment on the 0 to 10-point agenda, and all participants would be able to vote for the top recommendations, which would then be presented to the President-elect, then President-elect, at the end of the workshop. After describing the concept, I informed the then incoming Finance Secretary that we had previously run 21st century town halls in Asia and Africa when I was working for the World Bank. My future boss paused for a second and decided to take a chance on the idea. He said, okay, let's do it that way. But he also warned, I think half-jokingly, that if it doesn't work, it will be your fault. And he was looking at me directly, half smiling. Well, we did it, and fortunately, that first consultation, which we called Sulong Pilipinas, worked very well. And I think it worked because we kept quiet for at least half of the time and let participants share their own ideas. Since 2016, Sulong Pilipinas has been an annual workshop. Last year, we focused on micro, small, and medium enterprises, and we consulted around 1,000 MSME owners in Clark, La Union, Davao, and Cebu. The top recommendation from 2018 was to improve agricultural productivity via strengthening agriculture value chains. For the government, Sulong is not a publicity stunt. We actually pay attention and take our stakeholders' recommendations very seriously. People sometimes forget that many of the concrete accomplishments of the government so far were actually recommendations from Sulong participants, private sector actors such as yourselves. The National ID Law was one of the top recommendations from Sulong 2016. The Philippine government has been trying to adopt a national ID for decades. You know how it is sometimes when getting a valid ID requires that we first present another valid ID. As a result, many of our citizens do not have any valid ID at all, and we end up excluding the poorest from receiving vital public services. And they need them the most. Well, President Duterte signed into law the Philippine Identification System Act last August. In response to the call for a streamlined bureaucracy, another Sulong 2016 recommendation, President Duterte signed into law the Ease of Doing Business Act in May of last year. Agencies are now required to simplify processes, streamline procedures, and shorten processing times. The shortest, I think, is a maximum of 3 days for a business permit, for a simple business permit. Build, 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 as you know, is the very ambitious infrastructure program of the administration. Every year, a common theme raised by Sulong participants is the lack of inclusive growth in the Philippines. For perspective, annual incomes as measured by per capita gross regional development product, or GRDP, in the National Capital Region amounted to about 466,000 pesos in 2017. In scandalous contrast, average income in the ARMM, or soon to be BARMM, is about 31,000 pesos. One of the reasons why the disparity between regional income levels can be so large is because some parts of the country are better connected to the mainstream economy than others, something that was very obvious in Architect Palafox's presentation. Although our economy keeps growing, and at a very respectable 6.2% in 2018, many Filipinos are still left behind. So the government is investing in large-scale infrastructure upgrades, which includes building bridges, roads, railways, air and seaports, and more. So here's where we get to the tax reform program. Adopting a comprehensive tax reform program was the #1 recommendation of the business sector in Sulong 2016. The first package of this program, the TRAIN law, or tax reform for acceleration and inclusion. Two words are important in that name: acceleration, faster economic growth; inclusion, no Filipino left behind. TRAIN was signed into law by the President in December of 2017. The Department of Finance's proposals for the remaining packages are being deliberated in Congress, and just yesterday, we made headway in the Senate toward raising alcohol and tobacco taxes to fully fund universal health care starting this year. Incidentally, broader access to health care was one of Sulong 2017's top recommendations, and the universal health care law is going to be signed very soon. The comprehensive tax reform program is about investing in our future. It is not about plugging a deficit or paying our debts, which, as Richard alluded to earlier, were drivers of tax reform efforts in the past and in other countries. We are doing this on our own terms. We are making long-term investments for our future and would like to see the poverty rate, which was 21.6% as of 2015, fall to 14% by the end of the Duterte administration in 2022. That's helping 1 million Filipinos lift themselves out of poverty every year. We will see our country graduate from a low-middle income country status to an upper middle income country by this year. That's based on the World Bank criteria for what makes for an upper middle income country. And we need to keep investing so that we continue our trajectory toward becoming a high income country by 2040, where no Filipino goes hungry. That is a generation from now. That is the generation of my daughter, who is 11 years old. She will be 32 by then, and that is the Philippines I think I and all of us would like to leave our children and our grandchildren. Without tax reform, the poor will likely remain poor because there will be little investment in infrastructure, education, and health. Many people are saying that we do not need the tax reform because the economy is doing very well. And we say that that is true only if we want business as usual. But we do not want business as usual. We want substantial, meaningful change in the way we live and to impart to our children and grandchildren a far better future than the country we have today. Without tax reform, we will have fewer resources for rural infrastructure, such as badly needed farm-to-market roads and irrigation, and farmers would be hard-pressed to sell their produce to the market and move out of poverty. Without tax reform, urban congestion will remain a major challenge. There will be little improvement in public transportation. There will be more time spent in traffic. Personally, I spend at least 4 hours on the road every day. That is like being taxed 33% of my 12-hour productive day. There will be much less time for loved ones. Instead of having dinner and checking in on our families, we are stuck on the road. Without tax reform, poor quality education will pervade. The previous administration passed a very important education reform, the K-12 program. Our challenge today is to fully fund that by providing more than 100,000 new classrooms and hiring almost 200,000 new teachers. Without tax reform, classrooms will continue to be cramped and teachers overworked, hampering learning potential among our children. Without tax reform, quality health care will continue to escape the poor. Many of the poor, when they get sick, sell their assets, such as their motorcycle, their tricycle, or their carabaos, just so that they can afford medical care. And not knowing that when they get well, they have no more asset to use to improve their livelihood. The poor are likely to get sick and not be attended well if we do not provide more than 15,000 barangay health centers and over 200,000 new health workers to the countryside. Life is basically about having healthy mothers so that they can have healthier children. And once children are healthier, they can finish school. Once they finish school, they can get more and better jobs above minimum wage. And this is precisely the story and the reason why we are doing tax reform. Many people say we do not need tax policy reform because we can just improve the collection performance of the BIR and the Bureau of Customs. In fact, improving tax administration has also been our objective since day one. And we will continue to do so to make these improvements in the next 3.5 years. However, we still need tax policy reform because the problem is also found in the design of our tax law. For instance, we do not index many taxes to inflation, such that after 20 years, we have been losing billions because of this non-indexation, while prices, income, and our GDP continue to grow. Second, we have perhaps, out of good intentions, provide a lot of special treatments and exemptions to lobby groups, to interest groups, to sectors we want to protect, and to vulnerable groups. Many of these exemptions, while well-meaning, create a lot of leakage. And finally, we have no way to audit taxpayers because of our absolute bank secrecy regime. It is only Lebanon and the Philippines that have absolute bank secrecy in cases of tax fraud. That is why we need to reform tax policy if we are to help the BIR and BOC improve tax administration. As a result, we have one of the highest tax rates in the region. In fact, our income and VAT are among the highest, but we have a very narrow base. Half of the economy receives special treatment, does not pay some form of taxes. That is why we have a tax system that is inequitable, complex, and inefficient. That is the reason why, apart from tax administration improvements, we have to go to Congress month in and month out, week in and week out, including yesterday, to propose tax policy reforms. That is why we have a comprehensive tax reform program, which is being led by Secretary Dominguez and backed by President Duterte. In the first package, or the tax reform for acceleration and inclusion, important reforms were enacted to make our tax system simpler, fairer, and more efficient. I will discuss key aspects of TRAIN, the lowering of the personal income tax, the expansion of VAT, and the increase in the oil excise, the last being quite controversial. Let me begin with the good news. We are a country that has not adjusted or had not adjusted our income tax brackets for 2 decades. And we are a country committed to Asian integration where tax rates are falling below 25%. That is why we return to the people what they deserve. All their hard work in the last 20 years has been rewarded in the form of lower income taxes. From January to September of last year, the validated numbers will show that 103 billion pesos were not collected by the government anymore and are now additional take-home pay for income taxpayers. Under TRAIN, those with annual taxable income below 250,000 pesos are now exempt from paying personal income taxes. Previously, it was just the minimum wage earners who were exempt. The rest of taxpayers, except the richest, will see lower tax rates ranging from 15 to 30% by 2023. To maintain progressivity, the top individual taxpayers whose annual taxable income exceeds 8 million pesos, they face a higher tax rate of 35% from what was 32%. But here's an example. A call center agent with a 21,000 peso monthly salary, a 13th month pay, and a few bonuses previously paid 22,590 pesos per year in income taxes. Under our reform, that same call center agent will pay 0 personal income taxes, bringing home an additional 22,590 pesos per year. If they are two in the family earning at the same level, that is more than 40,000 pesos that they can use to buy groceries, to travel, but hopefully to save and invest in their children's health and education. We are returning to the people 140 billion pesos per year because of their hard work, but also because our economy will continue to grow because of this important reform. If you look at the consumption numbers, the top restaurant chain in the third quarter of last year posted a gross sales improvement of 42%. The second very popular restaurant chain posted a gross sales improvement of 27%. And even the higher priced alternatives showed, one of them showed an increase of sales by 7% just in the third quarter of last year. We're looking at the fourth quarter numbers now. If we stop here, it will be good for the people initially, but it will be bad for the country in the long term if we stop with just reducing personal income taxes. Because we will lack resources to deliver on the other commitments and promises of the administration. That is why we also needed to reform the VAT and oil excise taxes. On VAT, we have a very complex system. We have one of the highest VAT rates in the ASEAN, and in our tax law, we had 56 lines of exemption. Outside the tax law, we had 84 additional special laws proposing or giving various types of exemption on VAT. Compare that with our neighbors with much lower VAT rates, between 6 and 10%, and with far less line of exemptions, typically limited to agriculture, raw food, education, and health. That is why when we compare ourselves with Thailand, for instance, we collect about the same GDP in VAT, around 4.2%, but Thailand can do that with 7%, while we do that with a 12% VAT rate. Their base is broader because they have fewer exemptions. A complicated VAT system creates a lot of room for negotiation and discretion, and therefore corruption and tax evasion. That is why we cleaned up the VAT system and reduced the number of VAT exemptions. We did not touch the exemptions of senior citizens and people with disabilities. However, with a national ID system which was signed into law last August, we will be able to control the massive leakages that this type of complex tax system gives. The next reform I will discuss is the increase in oil excise. Prior to 2018, we had not adjusted our excise taxes on oil for 20 years. When I started driving in the late 90s, I paid 10 pesos per liter for gasoline, of which 4 pesos and 35 centavos was the excise. After 20 years, before 2018, much more financially stable because I had a job, I still paid 4 pesos and 35 centavos of excise tax per liter in excise. The truth is, because of non-indexation, and as the economy improves, and as incomes increase, and as prices increase, we lose around 145 billion pesos per year from this non-indexation. Money that could have gone to social protection, healthcare, and education. That is why we increased oil excise by 6 pesos per liter, staggered over 3 years. Many people tell us that this tax reform is that this part of tax reform is anti-poor because the poor will be affected the most and prices will increase. However, the Philippine Statistics Authority found that the top 10% of Filipino households, or the richest 2 million, already consumed 51% of fuel products and transportation costs. And the top 1%, or the richest 200,000 households, consumed 13% of fuel products and transportation costs. The same share consumed by the bottom 50% of households. The simple reason is that the more affluent households have personal vehicles with larger displacement engines. And sometimes only 1 or 2 people ride these cars. When I pay for a full tank in my car, I pay 2,000 to 3,000 pesos. The bottom 80% only pays 10 to 50 pesos per day in commuting fare. And for every 10 pesos that one pays for a jeepney ride, only 3 pesos is accounted for by oil. And the rest will have to pay the driver, the operator, the maintenance, and I also hear that there are bribes that need to be paid on the road. That is why we need to reform our excise on fuel, and that's why we did it, to arrive at a more progressive, healthier, and cleaner environment. To protect the poor and the vulnerable, the Duterte administration is also implementing social mitigating measures. Under the Unconditional Cash Transfer, or UCT program, the government, through the Department of Social Welfare and Development, is giving cash grants to the poorest 10 million households and senior pensioners. These are senior citizens with no SSS or GSIS. This will help alleviate the impact of the temporary and moderate increase in prices. As of December 31, 2018, we had disbursed 2,400 pesos to 8.9 million beneficiaries. Completion of 10 million families is targeted by the first quarter of this year. Under TRAIN, the government, through the Department of Transportation, is giving out fuel vouchers to public utility vehicles to compensate them from the increase in fuel costs. This temporary solution is given while waiting for the real solution, public utility vehicle modernization, which is also underway. As of January 15, more than 74,000 fuel cards have been distributed to franchise holders with legitimate franchises, among the public utility jeeps. Lastly, the National ID Program, again a top sulong Pilipinas recommendation, will help government target the poorest households with social protection programs. The bill was ratified by Congress in May, signed by the President in August, and the Philippine Statistics Authority released the IRR of the PhilSys Act last October. TRAIN is only one part of a bigger reform to make our tax system simpler, fairer, and more efficient. In Package 1, we requested households to contribute to the economy and the country by lowering personal income taxes, but broadening the tax base. In Package 2, we asked corporations to do the same. Having a corporate income tax rate higher than those of our neighboring economies is a big challenge and barrier to investment. We are optimistic that Congress will pass the second package of the comprehensive program, otherwise known as the Tax Reform for Attracting Better and High-Quality Opportunities, which seeks to help the country become more globally competitive by lowering the corporate income tax rate from what is currently the highest rate in the ASEAN region, 30%, to 20% over 10 years, and rationalizing fiscal incentives. The reform will encourage robust business activity, better tax compliance, and job creation. The Trabajo Bill will benefit more than 100,000 micro, small, and medium enterprises that pay the regular rate of 30%. On rationalizing fiscal incentives, which is being attacked by various critics, we would like to emphasize that we want to keep granting incentives for the right reasons. And we want these incentives to be performance-based, time-bound, not forever. Our neighbors give a maximum of around 20 years. Targeted in strategic industries and fully transparent. During Sulong 2018, we were able to consult roughly 1,000 micro, small, and medium enterprise owners, and more than 90% of them said they support the Trabajo Bill. In package 3, we ask property owners to contribute as well, while in package 4, we ask investors to do their part. Finally, as mentioned earlier, in package 2 plus, which was previously called package 5, just in case you've been following this in the developments in the tax reform program, we ask smokers, drinkers, and minors, or those who bring harm to health and the environment, to contribute more to this country. This tax reform is about investing in our future. No one here, I suppose, is successful without some hard work, challenges, and a bit of initial pain because of our schooling or our work or our business. And we think this tax reform, while initially challenging, will provide long-term benefits for the majority, if not every Filipino, especially for the next generation. Personally, we believe in our team that tax reform is about bridging the future. Take, for instance, 2 students. The rich or wealthy student who lives in a nice house, has a driver to bring her or him to school, has air conditioning, perhaps cold and hot water, electricity. For this student, chances are, if she is hardworking, she will succeed eventually and become a manager or a CEO. However, a poor student will have to cross rivers, mountains, dirty roads, have no running water, sometimes no electricity. They study by the gas lamps or flashlight or whatever they have. That is why learning potential is much less. This tax reform is really about bridging or paving a path so that the poor 20 million students who are not affluent by birth will have a far better fighting chance for the future. When we ask stakeholder groups who wants to change in support of these goals and this vision, they all usually initially say yes. In principle, we like the reform. However, when we ask them who is willing to change, not just who wants change, fewer people raise their hands. And finally, when we ask them who will lead the change with us, no one is left. When we ask people to support tax reform, they would initially say that they support it except for a certain provision, the provision that will affect them. And if we removed all of these provisions, we would have no tax reform left. This is why I encourage you, all of us, to look at the reform as a package. In a reform, there are many trade-offs. And in this reform, we have to balance many concerns, but focus on the interest of the country as a whole. If you wish to get updates on the remaining packages, you may visit our Facebook page for the latest news. If you like our Facebook page, you will automatically, I think, receive those updates on your feed. So may I invite all of us to do that. And of course, our website also has more detailed information, analyses, and updates. In closing, allow me to say that this comprehensive tax reform program has a very important role in making a lasting difference in each and every Filipino's life. For our families and millions of Filipinos who dream of a far better future, this is why we are doing this. Thank you very much.